Hi, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics. Every other Friday, we partner with author Rebecca Sive on a series of episodes we're calling Vote Her In, about our efforts to elect the first woman president. On today's episode, we have a very special guest. Rebecca and I are interviewing presidential candidate Marianne Williamson. If you like the series, you can find us online at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com/voteherin. You can also find these episodes in our regular stream at Apple Podcast, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Pocket Cast, on your Alexa devices, basically everywhere you can find podcasts. Enjoy. Hi, everyone. This is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics. I am joined today by my co-host for this episode, author Rebecca Sive. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
And we have a special guest today. We are speaking with Marianne Williamson. Hello, Marianne.
Hi, how are you?
Great. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
You are an activist, you're a spiritual teacher, a best-selling author, an entrepreneur, a mother. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you're running for president. Why now? Why is that the next step for you?
I feel there's a conversation America needs to be having with itself. And I believe that politics and political elections, and particularly the election of a president, should be a conduit for our deepest, most meaningful conversation. And I don't feel that happening here. I feel that the conversation that dominates our political establishment has become so shallow and so devoid of the kind of depth that is necessary for real transformation that I have chosen to offer a different conversation, a different vision, and a different agenda for our future.
Maybe the next place I'd like to go with the conversation is just to talk about, you lay out a lot of issues on your website, a lot of issues that you care about and how you would address them. But what I'm really curious about is what your first focus would be. What would be your emphasis right when you start? You know, there's so many things to focus on. There's going to be so much to clean up in the country. But where would you start your efforts?
Well, I believe that there's a cancer that underlies all the other cancers. There's an underlying cause to so many of the terrible symptoms of dysfunction and corruption in our government. And that has to do with the undue influence of money on our political system. So the first thing I would do is send to Congress a proposal for legislation that would establish public funding for federal campaigns. It's the only way that we can, at this point, override the very, very dark influence of Citizens United. So that's number one. Number two, and one of the main pillars of my campaign, and I think very related to this issue of why we need a woman, is the systematic collective neglect of millions of American children. And this, of course, is tied back to the nefarious influence of money, because not only are children not old enough to vote and therefore do not represent a constituency, they're not old enough to work. And so they wield no financial leverage. And in a system like ours, where our government has become little more than a system of legalized bribery, what chance do these millions of chronically traumatized children living in our society have to compete with the cloud of all these multinational corporate forces whose money flood Washington on a daily basis? So I want to establish a cabinet-level position, which is the United States Department of Children and Youth. We have a lot of good people doing good work within the government, don't get me wrong, having to do with help of these children. But the problem itself has become so overwhelming. We need a much more coordinated approach, and we need far more funding. We need far more focus. If I'm president, there will be a major realignment of investment in the direction of children in the United States. We have public schools in America that don't even have libraries. We're the only major country, the advanced country, that bases our educational funding primarily on property taxes. And so we are losing probably billions, if not trillions of dollars in unrealized economic potential over the next 20 years, simply by failing to develop the brains and the character and the educational potential of millions of American children. Many of them go to schools, millions of them, in schools where they don't even have the adequate school supplies to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot read by the age of 8, then the chances of that child's high school graduation is drastically diminished. The chances of incarceration is drastically increased. So we're just raising millions of American children for whom the track to incarceration, the track to opioid addiction, the track to all manner of dysfunction and pathology that doesn't just affect their lives, but affects our entire society is becoming more and more probable.
Related to this, one of the aspects of your agenda that I find really compelling and seems integrally related to what you're talking about is the issue of reparations. And of course, many of the children who are so, as you've described, deprived of good schools and equal opportunity to succeed are children of color. And I was wondering in that context how you would go about making these reparations and how you would see that help the families who receive them, in fact, succeed and achieve in a way that they haven't been able to.
I think we should appoint a reparations council, a kind of board of trustees. An amount of money is agreed on, $100 billion. Anything less than that is an insult. What I proposed is anywhere between 200 and 500 billion that would be dispersed over a period of 20 years. And the stipulation is that the money is to be used for purposes of economic and educational renewal. A lot of these children, and certainly it's a multidimensional problem, obviously, but so much of the legacy of poverty in these communities is based on the fact that there was an obvious and understandable economic gap at the end of the Civil War that not only was never closed, but which even in the 100 years after the end of the Civil War, there was another 100 years of institutionalized violence against Black people in America, which included in the South what we call the Black Code laws, which guaranteed subpar economic, social, and political opportunities for Black people. And then even when Black wealth began to be created in certain major hubs, et cetera, there would be efforts on the part of local and state governments to thwart those efforts. So much of what we're seeing now in terms of poverty in many of these communities is basically a legacy of that period of time. And I'm not minimizing or failing to appreciate the obvious successes and the obvious progress that has been made in certain ways. We did have the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Act dismantled segregation. The Voting Rights Act ensured voting equality for Black people. But, even there, we have chipped away at the Voting Rights Act since 2013, allowing for all these voter suppression efforts. And even more importantly, from a moral perspective, I think we would all agree that if you have kicked someone to the ground, and I think we'd all agree that 2.5 centuries of slavery is definitely kicking someone to the ground, and another 100 years of domestic, what is really we would call today an era of domestic violence against them in the South. I think we would all agree that if you have kicked someone, you owe them two things. You owe it to them to stop kicking, but you also owe it to them to put a hand and say, here, let me help you get back up. We have never done that.
Yeah, practically speaking, how would you go about that? I mean, obviously the history is absolutely miserable and awful, but so this amount of money you would allocate in this council, how would you go about ensuring it got to the families and was in fact used for the purposes that you're outlining here, which are, of course, laudable?
Yeah, this is not direct handouts to individuals.
This is
the money would be, this is why this council would be so important. Mm-hmm. The selection of this council, and there are many Black scholars, leaders in culture, academia, politics, who have given, in some cases, years to this study. And that's why, as I noted, the stipulation would be for purposes of economic and educational renewal. Now, how that money was then dispersed, I think you and I would agree. If I owe you money and I pay you back, I don't get to tell you how to spend it. So, except within the parameters of projects of economic and educational renewal. And, we would be handing a lot of money over. And certainly we would have the right to stipulate that it be projects of economic and educational renewal. Within that, however, the particulars would be left to this council, because that's the only way to do it correctly. You can't have white America telling black America what it's supposed to do with the money it pays them back. It's just that's a continuation of the paternalism at best that has gotten us into this trouble. I think that there is a moral and spiritual force that comes from reparations. That's why it's more significant than quote unquote race-based policies. Because race-based policies leave open the question, whose fault was all this? Reparations is the acknowledgement of a debt owed. It is an acknowledgement of a wrong done. It is an acknowledgement of an inherent mea culpa. And that's very, very important. And then this council that would be so carefully chosen, like I said, the stipulation, it would have to be within the parameters of economic and educational renewal. And that's also why I said 20 years.
We've had increasing numbers of men running for president without previous elected experience, the current president being one of them. But usually the women who run for office have a lot of elected experience. So I wondered if we could talk a little bit about the other kinds of experiences you have, things like founding and running nonprofits, and how that kind of experience really helps prepare you for something like the presidency.
Franklin Roosevelt said that the primary role of the presidency is moral leadership. And he said that administrative aspects of the job are secondary to that. I feel like we're living at a time when we need to expand our sense of political expertise and political experience and political qualifications to include a base level of wisdom. We have very experienced politicians who took us into Vietnam and Iraq, but the lack of wisdom was stunning. So my 35 years working very up close and personal with people has been helping people navigate the consequences of damage done often by an irresponsible political establishment. So I have a strong sense of where certain political policies either cap people's dreams or help people thrive. And policies that help people thrive produce peace and prosperity. That's the term people always use, peace and prosperity. It's like, are we even having a conversation anymore about an agenda of peace and prosperity? No, we're not talking about developing peace in our neighborhoods. We're not talking about developing peace in the world. And we're not talking about developing prosperity for anyone except a tiny portion of Americans, the 1% who own more wealth than the entire bottom 90%. So I want us to have a conversation about what it would take to create peace in the world. And I'll tell you something, I don't hear the political establishment even trying to have that conversation anymore.
And how do you factor in the moral leadership then has to be translated into specific policies and specific actions and wielding leadership over a huge bureaucracy? I mean, how does that get, FDR certainly was a master at that while he was talking about moral leadership. I'm wondering how you see the execution, the implementation of that idea of a new conversation about what peace would really, waging peace as opposed to waging war. I mean, functionally.
It's not really, it's not really mysterious because these things are expressed with very specific policies. I'll give you an example. We have now, for the sake of $100 billion in an arms deal, conspire, as we do now, with aerial support for a genocidal war that Saudi Arabia is prosecuting against Yemen. Tens of thousands of people have starved in that war, and many of them have been children. We see their pictures all over the internet. That's an example of complete and absolute abdication of moral leadership in the world. And that is what happens when economic values trump human values, when economic values trump the values of the heart, the values of brotherhood, the values of genuine democracy. Now, our current Secretary of State says in response to that Yemeni situation that you can have strategic partnerships with people who do not share your values. I do not agree with that. That means you've given up your values. There are factors that statistically are proven to increase peace in a system and decrease violence. They are mediation, development, diplomacy, expanding economic opportunities for women, reducing violence against women, expanding educational opportunities for children, and ameliorating unnecessary human suffering wherever possible. Now, a nation is like a person. You express your values through what you spend your money on. That's one of the ways you express your values. So we have a $718 billion military budget this year alone, and yet only a fraction of that amount is spent on projects within the State Department, within the USAID, within U.S. Institute of Peace, and so forth, which actually build up the factors that I just mentioned as being those that wage peace. And there's a reason for that, and it goes back to the financial corruption I was talking about initially. It's because waging peace does not produce immediate corporate profits. Preparing for war produces immediate corporate profits for defense contractors. It's not an accident. In this entire conversation, it's not an accident that the man who is now the acting chief of our Defense Department was a 30-year veteran of Boeing. And it's not an accident that the first Secretary of State in this administration was the ex-CEO of Exxon. It's a corporatist agenda. It is no longer an agenda that has to do with how we create peace and prosperity. And when I hear politicians who are only talking about how to treat a symptom here or a symptom there, and aren't even having the deep conversation, even the conversation that you and I are having, we're actually having a conversation about, well, maybe we should be hoping for and planning for peace for our children, peace for our grandchildren. They don't even go there anymore. The best they can go to is bring the troops home, or if we stay, I want to know what the exit strategy is. That's how superficial and immature and ultimately irresponsible the dominant conversation is, which goes back to your first question, why are you running? That's why I'm running.
So you have written a book called A Woman's Worth a while ago now, and you talk specifically about women's issues on your website. You say that adopting policies to protect women will help society protect itself. Nobody who's been president so far has focused specifically on women's issues, of course. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of women's issues and the importance of being the first woman president?
Well, I think in terms of the importance of being the first woman president, what comes up for me as an American woman is future generations will definitely look back at us and recognize us as the generation which did it. And whether we have a president this particular year or not, it is undeniable that we have made a breakthrough in female empowerment, unlike any that has been made in our country for probably since the women's suffragette movement. But my concern is not just that they be able to say that we did it, but they say we did it well. I think for many of us who are Democratic women, the most horrible thought is that the first woman president would be a Republican, right? That the first woman, it's just like too horrible to contemplate, right? The idea that the first woman president would be someone who is promulgating the values that so many of us as women has thought the whole point of female empowerment was to repudiate. So my concern is that we not get stuck in a self-congratulatory mode. And if I become president, then that will be my conversation. I will say we have a week to party, and then we have to be very, very serious about the charge that has been given us. You know, I remember when Ann Richards said Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did, but she did it backwards and in high heels. And I remember reading something Michelle Obama said about her being in the White House and how she and her husband had known that because they were the first Black family in the White House, they felt all eyes were on them in a different way. And I think that will be true for the first woman president, too. So it's extremely important that we get there, but it's also important once we do get there that we, at least in my opinion, display uniquely feminine values. And I think that everything that we've talked about here today is an example of that. How can we have so many women already in power in the U.S. Congress and have so many millions of American children living in chronic trauma? How is that possible? That it's possible because of so many women who, for reasons that I find mystifying, don't seem to think that putting children first politically and economically is what we should be doing. I do, however, and I feel it as a woman. I feel it as a mother. You know, in every advanced mammalian species that survives and thrives, a common anthropological characteristic is the fierce behavior of the adult female of the species when she senses a threat to her cubs. And no species survives that doesn't put the survival of its cubs first. And it's the adult female of the species which does that in every advanced mammalian species. So that's what I feel should be the biggest, I think, a mistake that not a mistake, how can I say it? I don't know if I'd say it's a mistake, but something that I feel is still missing is that when we talk about women's issues, I would like to see, and for me, included in that far more than is usually associated with women's issues, is the state of our children. Now, Jacinda Ardern, who is the Prime Minister in New Zealand, has said that one of her goals is for New Zealand to be the best place in the world for a child to live. And one of the first things I would want to be able to do as president is call her up and say, girlfriend, you're on, because I would very much welcome that healthy competition and would love to think that she and I together, as a matter of fact, could produce some serious changes throughout the world in how the women, the children are treated.
So just going back a second to this, collaboration, as you point out, you would do with the Prime Minister of New Zealand. What if it were the case? I mean, none of the three of us want this, but what if it were the case that the first woman elected president doesn't share the same view on many of these issues that we do, or that the many members of Congress and the Senate do? What would you see as your role in kind of moving her along and pulling people together to further the agenda? Because it just strikes me from what you're saying so passionately that the goal here is changing people's lives, and the election of a particular person is a means to an end. And so I'm curious as to how you would keep women mobilized to act in the face of either a male president, I guess, or a woman who might not share all of your views.
Well, I'll be doing what I've been doing for 35 years, as long as God gives me the opportunity to do it, whether I'm president of the United States or not. Over the last few years, I have hosted conferences called Sister Giant, about women running for office, about progressive values, et cetera. So I'm going to be doing that and standing for those things no matter who is president. It's simply up to the American people whether the power of the presidency is given me with which to do it.
This is sort of a lighter question, but, a lot of presidential campaigns tend to go with the sort of the bold red, white, and blue color scheme. And your color scheme, in fact, is more pink and purple. And, I was wondering if you could talk about sort of that mindset of thinking of running for president and having that kind of color scheme and, the kind of visual representation that you have in your campaign.
I feel that a mistake, and I think this is less now, by the way. I think it's less with this new generation, AOC, et cetera. But there has been in the past, and unfortunately, I think we saw it with Hillary Clinton, an overcompensation, a perceived need to show that we're tough enough. And so I thought that pink was a way of saying, I am a woman. I'm proud of being a woman. What's wrong with pink? Nothing deeper than that.
Well, I love it. It's really, it ends up being quite striking because it's so different. And a lot of the items in your store, for instance, they look totally different than what you're expecting to see in a presidential campaign. And because of that, it actually stands out more than you'd realize. So you're also the child of an immigration lawyer, and you've talked movingly about immigration and the importance of immigration. Could you expand on that a little bit? What you would see as sort of the way to look at immigration, the kinds of policies that you would want to see around immigration? That's such a hot topic right now, and it's something that I think we need to be thinking about really carefully.
When we began this conversation, I was talking about the fact that we have swerved from our basic values, and to welcome in the stranger. Welcoming in the stranger is a basic, not only spiritual value, but American value. That's what the Emma Lazarus poem on the Statue of Liberty. Give me, you're hungry, you're tired, you're hungry, huddled masses yearning to be free. We're blasting through all these really sacred social contracts that form the core of American values, and immigration is one of them. So we are a nation of immigrants. We all know that. Unless you were descended from American slaves or Native Americans who were here for thousands of years before the white settler got here, who do you think you are? You know, I mean, who do people think they are? My grandparents, all four of my grandparents came through Ellis Island. The idea that people come here seeking a better life, that's really what America is the constant, eternal search to be better, to do better. That's what America is about. We're always seeking the next best. But that has become circumscribed within a kind of materialistic context, which is actually diminished rather than increased and enlivened our national spirit to have more, to do more. It's not supposed to be just to have a bigger TV. It's to be to embody more fully who we say we are, both as individuals and as a nation. So I am one of the many millions of people who have been appalled watching this president demonize immigrants, particularly Black and brown immigrants, for his own political purposes. To me, the humanitarian disaster is not what's happening at the border, but the deeper humanitarian disaster is the horrifying despair that led so many people to walk across miles and miles and miles of desert to begin with, sometimes with their little children, in the hopes that they could escape hunger or violence and have a decent life for themselves. My grandparents were escaping pogroms. My grandparents were escaping 25-year conscription. My grandparents were, my great-grandparents starved. And I like to think not only that this country gave my family an opportunity for an infinitely better life, which it clearly did, but I also like to think that my family contributed to this country. And that's what we forget about immigrants. Immigrants aren't only people that get the prize by coming here. They are the prize to us as much as we are the prize to them. You know, if you look at what the immigrant has to learn, the immigrant who becomes a citizen, what they have to learn in terms of civics and American history and American government, the average immigrant knows infinitely more about the deeper functioning of this government because of what they have to learn to become a citizen than the average American does. And they infuse our culture with that hungry spirit. You know, I can do this. I can have this for my kids. This is a profound psychic river in the bloodstream of the United States. So you add to that the absolute cruelty. It's beyond un-American. It is criminal what they have done, separating these parents from their children. And you know, in the last few days, there's even been talk about sending these migrant children to Guantanamo Bay. So we are facing on that issue and in so many issues, it's such deep and profound transgressions against just our basic humanitarian and American values. And that's why I don't care who the nominee is, I will be doing, and it sounds like you'll be doing, and so many people that we know will be doing everything possible to make sure that the Democrat is elected in 2020.
So related to that, Marianne, I was really struck by, because I agree with you, we need something radically different than what we've had, to put it mildly, and I know we're all thinking that way. I was struck by that term you use of new paradigm leadership, and I wondered, you know, what that means in the context of a political movement, for instance, trying to elect a woman president, or if that's not possible, at least electing a president who is in favor of common moral values, and, you know, how that happens in the middle of what has become a very contentious, expensive, and, you know, disheartening sort of process.
Old paradigm leadership is where somebody sits on the top and just kind of dictates what's supposed to happen. New paradigm leadership is where the leader stands in the middle and holds space for the brilliance of others. Now, American governance was supposed to be what we would call today new paradigm leadership from its inception, because the governing principle, the governing force in this country was never supposed to belong to the leaders. It was supposed to belong to the people. And they were lending through elections their power to represent them. So our current political establishment has, in its own way, turned what should be the leaders into the followers. And that's why we have a kind of spectator sport population. That's what politics has become. In order to override the very nefarious influence and undermining forces that are eroding our democracy today, the people have to rise up. That's why I'm not running a campaign where I'm saying, send me to Washington and I'm going to fight for you. That's an example of old paradigm leadership. The president does not have a magic wand, which today, thank God, the president doesn't have a magic wand. Mm-hmm. What we need to do is we need to do more than defeat Donald Trump at the polls. We need to do more than bring a president down. We need to lift America up. And that can only happen if all of us rise. And that's new paradigm leadership. I see the president as a kind of opportunistic infection. He could never have gotten hold of us the way he has had it not been for a weakened societal immune system. Each and every one of us, every citizen, is an immune cell in the body politic of the United States. And the chronic disengagement of too many Americans have said things like, oh, I'm not political. What does that even mean? If you wake up in the morning and you in any way interact with American society, you are political, whether you think you're political or not. So many, and unfortunately, so many of the best and the brightest in America, largely, I'm afraid, because politics has become so toxic, have just checked out. And that's why we have to heal the field by recreating the field. And a lot of people that I meet, what I encounter, is the view, yeah, I'm willing to come back in, but not to be that. I'm willing to come in. I hear that this got Trump elected. I hear that this is a problem. I hear we need to self-correct, but don't try to get me to engage in that silly conversation that passes for political power today.
How do you then take that new paradigm of leadership and work with Congress? So we can talk about sort of disrupting politics and being a different kind of politician, but the Congress that the president will need to work with is still going to largely be the same kind of Congress. So how do you see that sort of relationship between the executive and the legislative branches working?
Well, I say to audiences all the time, if you're a Republican, get the soul back in the Republican Party. If you're a Democrat, get the soul back in the Democratic Party. Listen, I'm a Democrat. It does not help any of us that the Republican Party has been hijacked by a corporatist agenda. It doesn't help any of us. So my hope, of course, is that both Democrats and Republicans are going to awaken from the miasma of what politics has become. And when we do, Eisenhower said that the American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative. I'm a left-winger. There's certainly no doubt about that. But I understand that there are high-minded conservative values. And when there are high-minded conservative values, I'll give you an example, okay? Today, I'm in Iowa, right? So today, I visited an ethanol plant, okay? Now, the ethanol issue in the Midwest, and in Iowa particularly, is one in which there is an interplay. There's a yin and a yang. There's a complementary dance between economic values and environmental values. And that's not a bad thing, because it's not harsh and oppositional. It's just, it's a debate where we have a process where we have to balance these forces in order to come together to a better synthesis for everyone. When you look at things that used to be, when I was growing up, environmentalism, for instance, for goodness sake, Richard Nixon was a Republican and he established the Environmental Protection Agency. Taking care of our environment was not seen as some left-wing commie plot. It was something which everybody was supposed to care about. And the only question was, are you going to mainly have a high-minded conservative or a high-minded liberal agenda that is running the show, prevailing at any one particular time and any one particular point in order to get us to the goal that we all agree on. So today what's happening is not conservative or liberal, it is corporatist. Now, if there are Republicans in Congress, there are. I mean, there are high-minded conservatives in this country. And if I were president and there were Republican senators and Republican congressmen who were high-minded conservatives, I think they'd get along with me just fine. We'd have a lot of creative conversation. I'd be very clear on the president, though I have the power of the presidency, but they would have the power of the Congress, and that's as it should be. But these people, such as Mitch McConnell, that's not high-minded conservative. And Mitch McConnell, I think it's fair to say, none of us are stupid. He would not like me, and he would probably say about me what he said about Obama, which is his primary role is to make sure I have one term there. But my hope, and I think we have a chance for this, I believe that there's an awakening across the board. I have to believe that going on in this country. And I hope that it will lead to a different kind of politician in both major parties.
All right. Well, if our listeners like the things that they're hearing, how can they help out with your campaign?
Well, thank you so much. They can go to Marianne2020.com or any of Marianne Williamson for president, Marianne for president, those kinds of things. Easy enough to find, Marianne2020.com. And I'm grateful to you, and I'm grateful to your listeners, and I hope that people will support me in whatever way they can for a campaign that I believe is already making a difference, but hopefully will make even more of one.
All right. We'll put a link up on our website to your website and your social media. So, Marianne, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. This has been really great. I love this very unique spin that you have on politics. It's a totally different way of looking at things, and I really like hearing it.
Thank you, Marianne.
The Vote Her In segment is a collaboration of Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive. Our theme song is called Are You Listening off of the album Elephant-Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.